Hi, this is Tom Kemp. I'm the CEO of Centrify Corporation. Welcome to our ongoing Centrify Video Chalk Talk, where we give you deep dives into our technology and the issues facing customers as they try to address compliance and security, and how they can leverage Active Directory across the enterprise. So I'm joined today with Paul Moore, our CTO. This is part 2 on DirectAuthorize. And in the part 1, we talked about DirectAuthorize more at a high level in terms of talking about basic concepts such as roles and rights. We talked about the market need for DirectAuthorize and how you can go about assigning roles and rights to users and groups and the differences with sudo. In part 2, we're going to go really in depth with the architecture, and Paul's going to be using the whiteboard a lot right here. But before he jumps up there and talks about how DirectAuthorize works from an architectural perspective, for people that may have skipped or missed part 1,
shame on them if they skipped it.
Yes, but it's okay. We'll allow them to do this. This is the graduate level course, and that was more the junior senior level course on DirectAuthorize. What is DirectAuthorize?
So DirectAuthorize is our new technology for providing fine-grained access control over who can do what within Unix systems. So DirectControl already had some degree of control over that. DirectAuthorize extends that enormously by providing very precise control over exactly who can do what to the systems, how they can gain access to them, when they can gain access to them.
Excellent. So I think that's a good summary right there. And then key, before we jump in and talk about it, key to the capabilities of DirectAuthorize, there's this concept called a role, and there's a concept called a right. So why don't you just give a quick overview, and then we'll have you jump up there.
So a role is a definition of something you could say, this is Tom's role. For example, being a backup operator, being a systems administrator, being a database administrator. So a role is, let's say, Oracle administrator. And then a right is some particular thing that Oracle administrator would need to do. They would need to run this command. They would need to be able to log in this way to the machine. They would need to be able to run this privileged command and so on. So the rights, the detailed things that you can do, a role is a grouping of those things that creates a logical role, and then you can use that role and assign that to an individual user or a group.
Now, key to this understanding DirectAuthorize is the fact that we actually leverage Active Directory for this. In addition, so there's the storage, I assume, of roles and rights and the assignment of roles to users and groups within Active Directory, but then the actual enforcement happens at the local system.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So how do you want to start in terms of
So I was just going to dive straight in and just show how all the different pieces join together, the data flow that goes between them. And it's actually interesting to look at some of the challenges that you face, that we face trying to build this software, because some of it's actually quite hard problems to solve, and it's quite an interesting case study in its own right, as well as being a useful piece of technology.
Okay, go for it.
So at the heart of it, as at most of our software, we have Active Directory, the universal disk drive icon that is used to represent a directory. So one thing to emphasize is we've never changed the schema in AD. None of our products require schema changes to AD, and this is true with DirectAuthorize as well. I'll talk exactly about how we store that data within AD in a second. So the piece of software that the administrator is going to see is going to be our UI, and this is our MMC console. So that's how we deliver our UI for DirectControl and Direct Audit. So this just fits into that environment.
So this, in fact, is the DirectControl user interface for DirectAuthorize with the additional ability to define the roles and rights.
Yes,
and
this is an extension that adds some new nodes within the MMC tree, adds some new menu options, new property pages. So it's already works within the management flow that a manager would be used to using already.
And DirectAuthorize comes with DirectControl as part of our standard edition of the Centrify suite.
That's correct.
And so I assume, but if customers for some odd reason don't want to run DirectAuthorize, at least not now, there's some sort of switch they can flick?
Yes. In fact, it works both ways, in the sense that not only it comes turned off, but when I say both ways, it's actually very, very easy to turn on, even though it comes turned off in the box. There's one single checkbox. On a new page appears on a zone property. You check that checkbox, and suddenly DZ is enabled. But our default configuration is to do nothing. We spent a lot of debate about what our default configuration should be, whether our default should be...
Well, we're easing our customers into, because they're all direct control customers. This is seamlessly integrated. We don't want to shock them. So they just have to check a box and they get DirectAuthorize.
And also, if you install it, nothing happens. If you enable it, nothing happens, which is not quite such an obvious thing to do. There was a debate internally about once you've enabled it and you haven't given anybody any rights, does that mean now that nobody can log in or do anything? We felt that was too radical. So you enable it and still...
it's not until you start assigning
Not
roles,
until you create roles and assign roles to people that we start controlling what people can do. We've tried to make it so you can't accidentally shoot yourself in the foot, is what we really aimed for. So the UI, so this is our main console, and as I said, this is an extension to that console. This is the DirectAuthorize. I've just been told not to say DZ, but I'm going to say DZ because it's nice. It fits nicely into that box there, and that writes its data into Active Directory. So in Windows 2003 and onwards, Microsoft added to Active Directory a thing called Authorization Manager, which provided lots of tools, APIs, and so on. One of the things they did was they extended the Active Directory schema to, as standard, include objects for describing roles and rights and people's association to those roles.
This is already built. They don't have to do anything. It provides a mechanism for people to do this.
As with most of the things we're drawing here, the user doesn't actually need to know any of this, but it's always interesting to find out what happens. But yes, they don't have to do anything. Those schema extensions are already built into Windows 2003.
An authorization manager that people refer to as AZ, they may know it as AZ-Man.
Sometimes it's called AZ-Man, yes. And we, in fact, use the Microsoft's AZ-Man API here to actually write and read the data in here. So structurally, on the Windows side, it's actually relatively simple. Our UI is simply reading and writing data within
DirectControl UI with DirectAuthorize extensions, and like DirectControl, so the DirectControl UI provides a Unix view of the data into AD with the zones, the users, the groups. This adds that component, the roles and rights, and it stores the information in AD. So this provides, so obviously this means that there's not a separate data. People may ask, do you use a database or a separate database or a separate management server or a gateway? And this is all built into AD.
So absolutely, and in fact, as we discussed in part one, one of the things we wanted to make it sure was this was a no-brainer deployment. The only thing you have to do is check one checkbox, and it now works.
Cool.
It's very, and if you change your mind, you can uncheck the checkbox, and it goes away again. You don't have to put up any more servers or databases or install services in any places.
And even it's an AD-centric solution. There's no proprietary scheme extensions, and it's using, like how DirectControl, it uses standard ways to store the information in. And I assume that there's standard APIs and interfaces.
In fact,
right
this API.
That's great.
So as I said, that's actually the easy part. The harder part is what goes on the Unix side. So over here, this is the Unix side. So I'm going to. Hopefully, this box is big enough. So one of the core pieces of DirectControl, this is kind of like a recap almost of how DirectControl works, is we have a piece of software right in the heart of it called AD Client. This is our daemon, which we install and configure when DirectControl is installed, and it's this piece of software that's always responsible for communicating with Active Directory. It does all of the LDAP communications to read all the data about users and their group memberships and so on out of AD. It also does all the Kerberos traffic to authenticate users to obtain service tickets for people and so on.
And actually, one thing I want to bring up is that, because it's actually maybe somewhat misrepresentative to show it as a single database, because Active Directory itself is a replicated multiple domain controllers.
It's a multi-master replicated database.
So,
yes.
and then
So
for people that may not know that AD client is not hard coded to a single domain controller.
Correct.
It's talking to.
So probably a logically it works like that. Thinking is what AD is, but physically it's actually like this. So we write to AD one particular domain controller for that domain, and AD client may be talking to another domain controller, but between these two there will have been replication takes place. Mm-hmm. So this could be, for example, the administrator could be in New York and this machine may be in Paris.
Okay.
And it's reading, but they will be reading the same data.
I assume this is not gobs of data. I mean, obviously we never had an issue with DirectControl because it was basically the information and Etsy password, and I assume that the roles and rights.
This is a very small amount of data.
Yeah.
Replication.
Mm-hmm.
This is a very small amount of data. Typically it's a list of commands.
Okay.
And a small amount of data just saying this command belongs to this role belongs to these users.
Gotcha.
It's very straightforward. Right. For example, if you're working off group memberships, we're not propagating the entire list of the users in that group. We just propagate, it just says the name of the group, for example. So it's a very small amount of data. Yes. So anyway, AD client is our mechanism for communicating with Active Directory. It does Kerberos, it does LDAP. One of the nice things about it is because our software allows you to join the domain, one of the things that joining the domain means is that this machine is actually known to AD as a principal within the environment. So it has its own account, and so it can actually, that's what enables it to read Active Directory. It has a secure channel where AD knows that this is the machine that's actually doing it, and it knows the machine has credentials which allows it to do that. So the data. The challenge that AD Client, the new version of AD Client, which supports DirectAuthorize, faces is gaining access to the data that we just stored here. There are two challenges. I did a presentation at RSA a few months ago, an RSA conference, in fact talking about AZMan implementation in a cross-platform environment. This is before we'd made public the fact of what we were planning to do, and talked about the challenges of writing a Unix application which is tightly integrated with AD. Now, fortunately, we've already done all the heavy lifting for that within our, within DirectControl. But the challenges are: one is to get hold of the Active Directory data and do that in a secure manner. So there's a lot of challenges there: finding the right domain controller that's closest to you, having a secure channel to communicate with it, having the right credentials to do with it. And the second challenge is, if you recall, you can assign a DirectAuthorize role to a group. What that means is that when you try and do something, when you, Tom, try and do something, I need to know if you're in the member of a group, let's say backup. You're only allowed to do that if you're a member of that group. So I need to know in detail all the groups that you're a member of. So the other thing that AD Client needs to do, or a piece of software implementing AZMan would need to do, would be to understand what groups you're a member of. Fortunately, that's already code that exists in the existing version of DirectControl. So what would be very tough challenges for people to do starting from scratch is actually relatively straightforward for us to do. So AD Client reads, the latest version of AD Client now will read the data that's been created by DZ. This data is then passed on to multiple components within the operating system. So we have a component called DZDo. This is conceptually the same as sudo, in that if you want to run a privileged command, instead of typing sudo reboot, you type DZDo reboot. The difference being that the rules about what you're allowed to do are stored centrally and centrally managed. We talked about the advantages of doing that. So this is the one that is used to grant additional rights to people. The next component is within AD Client. There is already all the PAM applications within, all the PAM-enabled applications within the Unix environment. For example, up here, let's say SSH. SSH already makes PAM calls to the PAM code within AD Client. Now this PAM code is now aware of the rights and roles associated with that user. So that's how we do the PAM controlling, the throttle point we have for PAM there. And then the third component we have is a thing called DZ shell. Now DZ shell, the DirectAuthorize shell, is the component which implements the restricted shell. So one of the features we have within DirectAuthorize is the ability to create what some people have called a whitelisted shell, a tightly constrained environment that says, so in the definition of a role, we can say the user can execute these are the explicit list of commands that they're allowed to run, and these last two will run as root. Mm-hmm. All the others will run as the user that's currently logged in. If the user tries to type the seventh command, the command is rejected. If they try to run this as some other user, they won't be allowed to do it. If they try and run it as themselves, they won't be able to do it. It's completely transparent to them that it's running as somebody else. So this highly constrained shell environment is implemented by DZ shell, and now the DirectAuthorize shell. That shell is actually a modified version of the Bourne shell. So it works the same as the Bourne shell. It's got all the same built-ins that the Bourne shell has as well, except it has this additional filtering technology to restrict the list, and also the automatic privilege elevation. So what actually happens is if you type a command that we know needs to run as somebody else, then DZ shell will actually invoke DZ-do under the hood. You don't know that it's happening. It invokes DZ-do under the hood for you to automatically run.
So you don't have to type that command.
That's correct. You just type reboot. Let's suppose you're a patch administrator. One of the things a patch administrator might need is a reboot command because they need to reboot the machine. So they just type reboot, and under the hood we will do DZ-do reboot for you.
So one question I have is, so where's the time-based element? Because I assume that's actually transferred.
Yes, the definitions of the roles, the rights, and also the timing information for that is stored inside the AD data.
Yes.
And that's...
So AD client enforces that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and in fact that's our own extension to Authorization Manager.
Okay.
Authorization Manager itself doesn't have any concept of doing time-based things. That's something we've added because it was such a common request.
So in effect, these are enforcers.
Yes.
They're enforcers that are add-on modules that are bundled by default when you install the DirectControl agent.
That's
now,
correct.
What about cache, the caching capability? Because one of the problems that we've seen from customers with other vendor solutions, besides the fact that they're not Active Directory based and they tend to be very old and legacy, and they cost a lot of money and yada yada yada, is that they tend to always have to depend that the network's up. And so we obviously have addressed that with DirectControl, that we provide a local cache so people can still log in. Talk about, is the caching still in, does caching happen here?
In fact, it's exactly the same.
Okay,
so AD client has its own cache.
Yes.
Which it actually uses, it's drawn as one thing, but actually there's two logical parts to this. There's a cache which is used simply as a performance thing. Because the various components on Unix, not necessarily to do with DirectAuthorize, but DirectControl, need to know information about users and groups, and they need to know it a lot, all the time. If we had to go and query AD all the time, it would be very, very slow. So a lot of the information we go and retrieve is stored here, but functionally it doesn't make any difference. It's just a performance thing. There's another part of the cache, which is a functional cache, which provides the ability to do things while you're offline.
Okay.
So in DirectControl, as you point out, you can log in to a Mac with your AD user and password while you're sitting on an airplane. Clearly, we don't have a connection to AD.
Yes.
That's because we have those credentials cached in there.
And so say this is a big Solaris server that the network...
Which you're probably not using on an airplane.
Yes, exactly. But say it's a Solaris server, that the network's flaky, the backup operator logs in, that person's roles... I mean, the rights associated with the role associated with that user would have been cached, and so he'll still be able to do the voodoo that he do.
So we've simply taken the same model
Yes.
that DirectControl uses and used it for DirectAuthorize.
Okay.
And as they're very, very cleanly built on top of each other. They just reuse each other. That DirectAuthorize uses all the facilities that DirectControl was using for itself, and it reuses those.
Okay.
So all of the information about the rights and roles and their assignments is all cached on the Unix machine, both for performance reasons, we don't want to keep going back asking on the wire, and also so that if the network is down or for whatever other reason, we can operate even though we can't reach Active Directory.
So say AD user Tom Kemp, I'm Unix enabled, and I can have access to the zone in which this computer resides in. And so the administrator, and I assume, oh, by the way, I assume the delegation capabilities that we provide with DirectControl are also enforceable with DirectAuthorize.
Yes,
so you
correct.
can specify who can do what within DirectAuthorize.
You can specify who can control the roles. It's an additional permission within the DirectControl zone.
That's phenomenal.
Yeah.
So here I am, Tom Kemp. I'm a backup operator, and we've set up a situation in which I have a restricted environment right here. I can only type this. So walk me through, and I assume that as part of a role that maybe I can only SSH in.
Correct.
So kind of show Tom Kemp logs onto the system, kind of do the workflow from there.
Okay. So actually, let me just add a little extra juice to it.
Good.
Which is, let's suppose you're both an Oracle administrator and a backup operator.
Okay.
Because you get very interesting or let's say you're an Oracle administrator and a Sybase administrator. Maybe you
have different rights, or a web person that has a responsibility for the MySQL database.
So, but the interesting point there, if we actually look at how you would actually configure those, before we go in details of what the flow would be. So imagine this is the restricted command set for an Oracle DBA, right? And that would be all Oracle commands focused on doing Oracle. We would have another one for, let's suppose, DB2, right? There's another set of commands associated with that. Some people are only Oracle operators. Some of them are only DB2 operators, but some more senior or had more training or whatever, they're both, right? So if you log on, we have to discuss what happens in that situation, because there's some interesting things happen there. So if we look at, we'll take Tom as being the example where you're actually assigned both of those roles.
Yes.
I'll draw it down the middle here. So the first thing that happens is you connect to SSH. So what SSH will do is make a PAM call. It will do a PAM authenticate call.
Okay.
Because you've entered a user and password, and SSH is a PAM application. So over here, it actually calls the application side of the PAM infrastructure. That is dispatched to AD client. That's just how all of our PAM stack works in the existing prior to 4.2 implementations of DirectControl. The difference being, before it would just ask AD, is this a valid user and password? Now it will ask AD client, not only is this a valid user and password, it also verifies that you are actually allowed to use that particular PAM gateway.
And if the user actually had previously logged in at a Kerberos ticket, it would just validate the Kerberos ticket as well. If they
Correct.
Come in from
Correct.
remotely.
And in that case, it would still do the same check, though, to see that you're allowed to come in via SSH.
Okay.
So typically what would have happened here, you would have, this would be the command set, and we would have said you're allowed to log in via SSH here, and we would have said you're allowed to log in via SSH here, and these two role definitions. So AD client will look to see, it will enumerate all the roles that you've got assigned to you, in this case 2, and it will look in each one of them to see whether you have SSH assigned to you or not, and if you do, it'll let you log in. If it doesn't, it'll just, SSH will come back saying your account is not authorized to do this.
So even before they get into the box, we'll give them a yay or an A.
Correct.
Okay.
So that's the first thing that's happened. Now the next thing that happens is we need to work out, have you been assigned what's called a restricted environment or not?
Okay.
So what we've modeled here is that the only roles you've got are these two roles here, and these are restricted environment roles. And so what will happen is you have now, so here is Tom Kemp's shell. Now, this is TK's login session. We haven't loaded a shell yet.
Yep.
So SSH started that for you, right? One of the first things that shell would then do is it goes what's called an NSS lookup to find out who you are, what shell you use, what home directory you use. Fortunately, that's cool. DirectControl has already plumbed into that pathway. That's one of its main jobs. And again, the NSS module calls AD client to say, give me all the information about this user. If you're in a restricted environment, the AD client, and the way it tells that is, again, it looks at all the roles that are assigned to you and says, are those roles all restricted shells? And if they are, it'll say you're in a restricted environment, and it'll change the data associated with you. Let's say it normally says bin bash as your shell.
Okay.
It will actually replace that by bin dzsha.
Okay.
And force you to load this shell here. So what you'll end up doing is loading DZ shell rather than loading the Bourne shell that you're actually configured to use. Now the interesting thing is now that you've actually ended up you've got two restricted shells, right? You've got one for the Oracle command set, one for the DB2 command set. Our original design was that we would merge these two command lists together, and you'd be allowed to type anything from this list or anything from that list.
Okay.
The problem with that is that we not only do we allow commands, but we also elevate commands. So we have complicated rules that you have to specify, saying, well, not complicated, but you have to specify rules and masking matches, regular expression matches to say which commands run as which users for you. And it's possible that there's ambiguity between these two. We found out that we couldn't have both those command sets active at the same time because you would be ambiguity going on. And we don't like ambiguity in security products. You don't want unexpected behavior happening. So what happens is that when you log in, so the DZ shell will start, and you will be told you are in the role Oracle. It actually just takes the first one it finds and says you're in the role Oracle. And so available to you will be all the Oracle commands. Okay. If you want to do something in DB2, you actually say role DB2, and you now can do these commands. We'll tell you if you just type
toggle.
Yes, you can switch backwards and forwards, or if there's three, you can. And if you just type the word role, we'll say you're in Oracle DB2 or whatever, and we just choose one as a courtesy for you. So you have to tell us which restricted command set you're actually choosing to use, and that is just to make sure that we don't have any ambiguity. Like I said, you don't want non-deterministic behavior, unexpected behavior in a security product.
Can a system administrator, from a command line perspective, see what commands are associated with which roles? Can you actually just do a query of the role definition?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. You can query up here. You can say you can pick a user and say show me all the roles that they can do, show me all the commands they can do, and that's actually not even restricted to a zone. So we can say globally for the entire forest, show me everything that Tom Kemp can do based on his DirectAuthorize roles, not just within this zone, but within any zone. So you can very easily see, and you can also get the inverse, which commands are in which roles, and so on. If you were in a different situation, so this is a situation where you've been assigned a restricted role. Mm-hmm. If you were assigned a non-restricted role, so this is where we talked about the other mode, which is the mode of granting rights to people rather than constraining them. In that case, we define a role. Again, let's say you're a DBA. But in this case, what we do is define a list of commands which you can choose to run as somebody else, which is not the same as forcing you to run them, and doesn't limit you to only those three commands.
You can run anything.
So you can run anything. You can do what you normally could do. Doesn't necessarily mean you can run anything, but you could run what you could normally do. And in that case, when you log in, what happens is that, again, let's suppose we've again said this is an SSH PAM gated application. So again, you'll connect. SSH will call PAM, which calls AD client. and that will then say yes or no whether you're allowed to log in or not. And if you're allowed to log in, we'll load your normal shell, because we'll look to see, are you in a restricted shell, and you're not. So in this case, we will load bash or whatever you're set up to load. And now you've just got your normal shell. You can type whatever commands you want. If you then want to run this command 1 here, you would actually type dz-do command 1.
Okay.
Right. In the definition in here, you can specify which users it will run as. So we can say you can't choose, it will always be root, or it will always be the reserved Oracle account or whatever, or we can give you a choice, and in which case there are flags for you to choose which account. Of course, always remembering that we can specify the timings of when that is available or not. So for example, if it was only available at 2 o'clock in the morning, then if you try and dz-do otherwise, it will just say that's not authorized.
Great. Is there anything, I think we've covered most of the data flow here. We've talked about the enforcers, the integration with DirectControl. We've talked about how to store the how we store the information within Active Directory, and the integration with DirectControl from a user interface. Is there anything else that, I think we've kind of covered the workflow and what happens when someone logs in. Is there anything else you want to add?
There was one question that actually comes up repeatedly, which is how you deal with shell scripts up here, because people are saying if a user with a DirectAuthorize shell environment is only allowed to execute these 5 commands. So again, let's go back to our Oracle thing. They're only allowed to execute these 5 commands. How does that work with shell scripts? Because in many cases, a lot of the commands are actually implemented as shell scripts, which may have dozens of commands in there, but you don't want to grant the user rights to those ones. In fact, that works perfectly well, because if you look, so let's imagine that this command here is actually implemented as a shell script. If you actually look inside that command, you'll see that it starts out like this. And then the actual shell script follows after it. And what that tells Unix is that when it runs this is not a binary, but this is a set of commands that needed to be fed into this. And this, bin show, we don't control. So this is the standard system shell. This can run anything. So as long as, if a command is implemented as a shell script, it works fine. You can run any command you like in there, and it works fine. But that's not a security hole, because a user can't write a shell script and run it as bin show, because when they try and type the command to run the shell script, we won't let them type the command to run it, because it's not on their list of 4 commands to run.
So system administrators can define the roles and rights. There can be delegation in terms of who can do what from an interface perspective. And then a system administrator could also, from a command line perspective, see what the roles and rights are as well. So
on the Unix side.
On the Unix side as well. So the sysadmin, has the ability to, carefully define the roles and rights and see what the actual resulting roles and rights are as well. So this is sounds like it's a great tool and solution for the sysadmins who would be responsible for help setting this up.
Yes.
At the same time, it addresses the audit requirements for the whole concept of least access.
Yes.
As well. Okay, great. Anything else you want to add from architecture perspective as well? So that's great. So to summarize, so let's talk about, and let's make sure people get this clear. So the direct control aspect of it, which you described, allows the Tom Kemp or the user to log in as themselves.
Yes.
Right? That's the key thing. And then through the zoning capability, they can only log on to the systems that they have access to. So that's the which aspect. Mm-hmm. And from what you've described with DirectAuthorize, it sounds like it can control what they do, either through the restricted shell or dz-do, right there.
Yes.
Okay. It also can control the time aspect of when they can log on and do the things they can do. And then you've also described the how aspect through the PAM aspect of DirectAuthorize as well. And then the one thing that we didn't talk about is the whole direct audit piece here as well, which actually facilitates the auditing all the sessions that they have on the actual system itself. Did I get that right?
Correct.
Okay,
that's right. Yes.
All right, good. So hey, even I can figure it out. It's pretty straightforward. So thanks a lot, Paul.
Okay.
And thank you for watching this. This concludes part 2 of our 2-part series on DirectAuthorize. We've recorded a bunch more webinars and Chalk Talks, and of course DirectAuthorize is going to be featured in one of our Gartner Group series of webinars on beyond authentication, with the focus of authorization in a Unix Linux environment. So thank you very much for watching this, and we'll see you on another Chalk Talk. Thank you very much.